Okay, this week's Parsha is Parshat Truma, which is, of course, why we're not doing anything about Parshat Truma. I did actually once give a model lesson at a school where I actually gave something on Parshat Truma, and I got the job. But nonetheless, I figured we'll see what happens next week. I don't know if it's going to work out or not, but for at least 1 week, maybe 2 weeks, I figured we would concentrate on Purim anyway, as we did earlier in the year in terms of the other Chagim. And I picked a topic actually before I even mentioned the topic, which you might have seen. I just want to point out, like, usually I try to have like a very rationalist, and I get into philosophy and all my anti-Rambam stuff and Rav Kreskis and Rav Yehuda Levi. I think that sometimes, like, we particularly guys like me, like, we kind of like overthink things. Like, sometimes we get like so into the ideas and so into the logic and the philosophy that we kind of lose the ability to feel things. And as I hope to build a case for tonight, Purim, I think, is really about a certain experience. It's not supposed to just be like, okay, you do certain mitzvot and whatever it is, but there's a whole experience that's supposed to come with that. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to be speaking about, there's a famous Gemara in Masechet Megillah, which is where most of the stuff that we know about Purim is found. Seems to be a very, very popular halacha in certain parts of Brooklyn and Passaic, where I live. People get very, very strict with this every year. And of course, I refer to the Gemara about drinking. Right? It says, see if I can find this. Amar Rava. This is on Daf Zayin Amabet. Amar Rava Michayev Inish Livsume Bepuria Ad Lo Yada Ben Arur Haman Baruch Mordechai. So Rava says that a man is obligated. Livsume means literally to become, like perfumed, but it's basically understood to be intoxicated on Purim until he does not know the difference between cursed is Haman and Baruch Mordechai. Now, again, as I said, there seems to be, there are certain halachot that people seem to really enjoy keeping, and this is one of those, particularly, right, exactly. Especially for guys like who are in yeshiva and maybe the rest of the year, they're supposed to, they're very tight rules, so this is kind of generally a chance just to do whatever they want. And of course, like, there is actually a whole discussion, is it actually a halacha, is it not? There's a story that comes afterwards where someone got injured or maybe even killed, however you want to understand what that means. And there's a whole discussion, does it really apply? I'm not going to get into it. Again, I don't want to touch on the halachic side tonight. What I really want to talk about is just, it's such a strange concept, whether you want to call it a halakha or just whatever you want to say that Rava was saying. It's such a strange concept for Judaism. If you look, in general, the mind is something that is so essential to Judaism. The idea of learning, of studying, of thinking. It's just, it's such an important midah. And on the other hand, of course, like, drinking is not, a Jewish value, right? It's like, no offense towards my Irish friends, and I love all things Irish, but, if you go to, like, the St. Patrick's Day parade, there's always, like, a whole bunch of, arrests for being, drunk in public and all this. The Israeli Day parade, you just don't have people, like, walking around getting smashed. It's just, but even more so, like, especially, like, on a Torah side, the idea of, again, just, like, losing your ability to really think clearly, so that to the point, it's not a Jewish value. To the point where, it's asur to pray if you're in a state where you wouldn't be able to stand before a king. It really is. It's not. The Kohanim are not allowed to do the avodah in the Beit Hamikdash if they're drunk. So it's not. And yet all of a sudden you have this idea by Purim that, again, and this is a fairly high level. It's not just you're supposed to have a cup of wine. Because there are there's mitzvot of kiddush. There's havdalah. At a wedding there are times you're supposed to have a little wine. 4 cups on Pesach. This is you're supposed to basically get intoxicated to the point where you don't know the difference between cursed is Haman, Baruch Mordechai. That's pretty darn drunk. So the question that I want to look at is how is that, where is this all of a sudden coming from? What's the idea behind this? And again, you're going to see tonight that almost all of my sources are not going to be like the usual Rambam. The people who really get into this the most are a lot. There's a lot of Torah on this in terms of the Hasidic rabbis. There's a lot of kind of deep stuff with this. There's a lot. It's definitely more the mystical, Kabbalistic kind of getting beyond the rational thing. And and again, as I pointed out before, I mean, I'm not a chassid. I don't have an interest in becoming one. But I do find that Hasidic Torah has like a certain profound depth to it, and I hope that I can bring that out tonight. So we're a little bit over a week away from Parshat Zachor. I'm actually not going to read to you. I am going to read to you the part that we actually read on for Parshat Zachor. Zachor et asher asalecha Amalek. You should remember what Amalek did to you. B'derech b'tzeitchem Mitzrayim, on the way when you were leaving Egypt. Asher korcha b'derech. Korcha is a strange word. We'll say it, like mikred. They happened upon you on the road. V'yizanev kol nechashalim acharecha. They cut down all the people who were in the back. V'ata ayef v'yageya, and you were tired, and you're exhausted and tired. V'lo yarei Elokim, which is interesting. Doesn't mean the Jews weren't fearing God or Amalek didn't. V'haya b'aniach Hashem Elokecha lecha mikol oivecha misaviv b'eretz asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha. When you finally get rid of all your enemies and you come to Israel, then Timcha et zecher Amalek mitachar hashamayim lo tishkach. You're supposed to wipe out the memory of Amalek. You're not supposed to forget. And there seems to be two different mitzvot. One is, you're supposed to remember. You're supposed to wipe out their memory. You're also supposed to remember. And it's kind of an interesting thing. Like you have to wipe out their memory, but you have to remember what they did. It's kind of, it's a little bit, which one, comes first. And of course, I don't want to get into this, although you could get into a very big discussion about this. It's a very strange, want to talk about another strange mitzvah, the idea that, and especially for, living 70 years after the Holocaust, you're supposed to commit genocide against the people. You're supposed to wipe out Amalek, the men, the women, the children, the animals. It's basically, it's a very, very difficult halakha to wrap your mind around, and certainly, fortunately, we didn't end up like our Muslim cousins. There are no people known as Amalek. There is no real sense where this mitzvah, in whatever sense it applied in the times of Tanakh, it certainly has not applied for over 2,000 years. So it's more of a theoretical concept. It's not like we're wrestling with the Jewish ISIS over here. Fortunately for the Jewish people, that didn't develop. But it's still, at least morally, it's a big question. But even if you move away from that in general, what is Amalek? Why is it so bad? There are a lot of nations the Jews fight. There's the Plishtim who come up all throughout so many books of Tanakh, and there's Moab and there's Ammon, and why is that out of all of them that Amalek is just this this evil nation? And Bilam, when he goes and he cursed them, he calls them the Reshit Goyim, right? This is one of the famous ideas that, right, what were they the first to do? They were the first ones to attack after Kriyat Yamsuf, right? That there's a very, very famous mashal about, everybody, we know from Az Yashir, all the nations here, and they're afraid, and no one wants to start up. And, and it's compared, the mashal compares it to like a tub of hot water, where everybody's afraid of getting burned. And then, this one guy goes and he jumps in and he burns himself, but in doing so, he kind of cools it off, and now other people are willing to attack. And that's, of course, a play on words. What we just said before, karcha is probably from the word mikra, but it's also kar, that they're the ones, the midav Amalek is they cool things off, right? In other words, they very much, and again, however we want to say that a nation can represent this, as opposed to individuals, but they represent this idea of kind of like the opposite of what of what Bnei Israel is supposed to represent. Bnei Israel is supposed to bring godliness into the world. Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That everything ein od milvado. That God is this whole power, and Amalek is the exact opposite. Amalek is this idea to cool you off, to make you not think about things. To they represent if Bnei Israel represents Mi Ka'amcha Yisrael Goy Echad Ba'aretz, they represent division and duality and just this split where just a split between so many parts of ourselves, so many times, especially modern man, I think this is true, we don't even know who we are. There's so much, we have so many, Billy Joel, he always talks about, the stranger and the masks that you wear. And, again, this whole idea of, not being, the same on the inside as you are on the outside, or even, knowing who you really are. This is really what Amalek represents. They really have this quality of, cooling you off of, and again, and the word mikra, the whole idea that rather than seeing Yad Hashem in your life, just seeing, the whole idea of coincidence. And this is the this is really the midah that they represent. There's actually a interesting midrash, Midrash Tanchuma, also right over here from Parshat Ki Tetzeh, which is where Parshat Shoftim comes from. Let's see if I can find this. Where it says as follows. Zachor and Asher Asalacha, remember what they did. Kan Kativ Zachor, here it says Zachor, Ubishabat Kativ Zachor, and it also says by Shabbat. Shnehem Shavim, they both have memory mentioned with it. They sound like they're equal. Amar Shlomo, and we're going to come back to Shlomo, right? And what is the midah of Shlomo? What is Shlomo known for? Chachma, right? I'm actually, see, you guys had a positive effect on me. I went to that shiur a couple of weeks ago, whatever they call that Tanakh,
study.
The Tanakh study. I went to that, and my wife and I decided, we started off with Melachim, we started learning that. We just came to this very recently, about Shlomo being Chacham Mikol Adam. So, he's the one who understood everything, and all these mashalim, and it says, Amarti ani belibi, k'mikrei haksil gam ani yikreni. Right? I mean, in Sefer Kohelet, Shlomo is just like this, it's like this existential angst, where you have this guy who literally has everything. He's the richest guy in the world, and he's got, and he's the smartest guy in the world, and he's and he's just, and he's got a lot of wives, which, maybe is a positive thing too. And yet here he is, he's writing in Sefer Kohelet, he's the guy who has everything, and yet he's wondering what it's all about. In the end of the day, it's like, you have everything, right, right, I mean, you just, but what's it all about? You gather everything, you have all these, you have these gardens and these palaces, and but what's it about? I mean, in the end of the day, and very famously, it's Sefer Kohelet, I mean, it's a very complicated Sefer, but it's so depressing, because it's such a message of Hakol Hevel, everything is meaningless, and he tries this, and he tries to understand this, and it's just, so he's going through over here, it says, and it says his famous words, V'amarti ki ein zichron l'chachamim k'tzil lo'olam. There's no difference, between the chacham and the k'tzil, right? It doesn't make a difference whether you're a wise guy, smart, not a wise guy, we have enough of those, but, whether you're really, really smart or you're a fool, you're both going to be remembered. I mean, what's the difference? When you're in the ground, who cares? And again, we're going to come back to Shlomo, but again, it's very telling that, a guy who has all this wisdom, who understands so much about the world, there's something that's beyond him. And I think that this is true. When we try to think about what's the purpose of life, what's the meaning of life, that's not just something, you can be a very smart guy, you can know a lot of information, but it's kind of hard to get to that. So, we see over here, this whole idea that it's connecting already to Parshat Zachor, but this idea that somehow wisdom, somehow knowledge sometimes is not enough. And we're going to come back to Shlomo a little bit later, but it's interesting. He's this he's on top of the world, he rules over much of the world, and he's worried who's going to take over after me, right? Who knows whether the king who's going to take over from me afterwards or not is going to be wise or he's going to be a fool. And of course, to some degree, not literally in terms of right away, but who ultimately inherits literally, according to the Midrash, the throne of Shlomo? Who's the king who sits? Achashverosh, right? It's kind of interesting. Here was Shlomo's greatest fear, that he's going to work so hard, he's going to build something up, and who knows who's going to be the next king. And you have Achashverosh, who was in many ways very, very foolish. There's a big question: was he, smart like a fox? Was he dumb like a fox? That he was really just there was a wisdom behind her, or was he just this fool? But whatever it is, it's just kind of this is Shlomo's worst nightmare. His entire life, he builds up, and then it just, someone else takes over and just destroys it. It's like the father who, it's kind of like the Steinbrenners, right? George, buys the team, and he buys his way to all these championships. Okay, you could tell him a Red Sox fan, but there's a certain degree of success, and then all of a sudden his sons take over, and they don't want to spend the money, and they're not as committed, and they're more into, it's just that's the thing. A rich person, maybe, he looks at his whole life, he builds up this whole empire, and then, who knows what happens next? In other words, it could all be gone. If your kid is, is into, drugs or women or some combination thereof, it could all be gone. So you have Shlomo, who, on the one hand, represents all these different things, and yet he's very, he wonders what it's all about. He wonders what the whole purpose of, of just what the whole world is about. So that's one level. Again, he's kind of like he's trying to figure out what the purpose of the world is. And again, and he even uses a similar word to, mikra echad l'chacham u'l'ktzil. The same thing happens. It's mikra. In other words, life seems to him like it's just chance. You can do it. You can work hard. You can, do your best. You can even be successful, and yet, you don't control what comes after you're dead, and then it could all fall away. So we see already, like, this is kind of, and that's what Amalek represents as well. Just this sense that, like, kind of life is just totally by chance, and it's random, and to a certain degree it's cruel. And, so this is where we, find ourselves. And the Gemara in Masechet Chulin, it asks what seems like a strange question. If it meant it literally, it would actually be a ridiculous question. But it asks, how do we know, about certain characters from Purim from the Torah? Which, of course, is strange because Purim story happens many hundreds of years after the Torah. So obviously, you could sometimes say maybe the Chachamim believed a certain midrash literally, but I think over here it's very, very clear that they did not. It says as follows. Let me see if I can find it. Old age is really a killer. Here we go. All right, I'm not seeing it inside. I'm not going to. I won't read it direct, but it says, it asks the question. It says, Esther min haTorah minayin. How do we know about Esther from the Torah? Right? At Shinamar, Vanochi hastir astir et panai. I will hide my face. Right? It says like a play on words, but it's connected to the idea again. That this world. And this is, of course, going to be a message of Purim, that there's something about the Purim story that really has Hester Panim, right? What's Hester Panim?
Covering of face.
Right, like literally, like God's face his presence is hidden. Right? Where do we see that in the Megillah? Where do we see that God is hidden in the Megillah most obviously?
It's not.
Right? It's strange. It doesn't come across like a book of Tanakh. God is not mentioned there at all. And this further plays into this idea that, seemingly this is a story that is just, it's a very interesting story, and there's intrigue, and there's the good guy and the bad guy, and who will win, and the queen, but it doesn't come across as like a particularly religious text, right? And then it says Haman min Torah minayin, right? As it says, Hamin ha'etz hazeh tochal, right? So Esther represents this idea, and then Haman, who again, at least midrashically, is considered to be a descendant of Amalek. That it seems to be that this whole sin, this whole idea of Amalek, of the whole world being like fractured and broken, comes from the eating of the Eitz Hadat, right? Famously, right? The Rambam says that beforehand, it's a famous question, right? Like, what happened to Adam? What was Adam before and what was Adam after? And of course, it's not meant literally. I'm pretty darn sure there never was an actual Adam, but like, what did he represent before? And the Rambam says it can't be that before he didn't have any knowledge and then he got knowledge, because that would be a reward, right? Especially for a guy like the Rambam, it would be very strange that you do an Aveirah and you go from being a guy who with no seichel to a guy who has seichel. So the Rambam says very famously, he says that beforehand, Adam, acted based on emek v'sheker, what was true and what was false. Then he says afterwards, after the sin, what does he have? He has tov v'ra. Right? What's the difference between emet v'sheker and tov v'ra? Emet and sheker are objective facts. This exists or it doesn't exist. This is, Earth is a planet or it's not. Objective, whatever you want to call it. Hard,
semantics,
right? Logic, rationality, etc. And now, what's Tovara? It's subjective. In other words, it's right. It's like every person, has their own sense of it, and people can argue the very same action. So this is what's going on over here. That in other words, and this is like kind of like the beginning of the trait of Amalek. This idea of like this fracture between, what is truth and how do we know, and what's the right thing to do, and is this a good action or a bad action? So we have this whole thing developing over here where Shlomo, feels like life is mikra. You have Amalek which represents the same thing in our life, that just tries to say like, it was bad coincidence, it's bad luck, it just happened. And you have Esther, the idea that, Hester Panim, again, a world where God is not felt. So let's develop this a little bit more. One of my favorite Gemarot, Mesechet Shabbat, really, I think I've mentioned this before. Really, fascinating Gemara. Right? It's on Daf Pechet. Here we go. Right? V'yityatzvu b'tachtit hahara quotes a pasuk. by Matan Torah, and they stood at the base of the mountain, but it says betachtit, literally like almost like underneath the mountain. Amar Rav Avdimi Bar Chama, well, again, I think that says Chasa, Melamed Shekafa HaKadosh Baruch Hu Alehem Et Hahar Kigigit. What does it mean that they stood under the mountain? That God lifted up the mountain and held it over them like some sort of like a bowl type thing, a gigit, like a cask, I think is the word they usually use. He lifts up Har Sinai over their head and he says to them, Imatem mekablim haTorah mutav, if you accept the Torah, great. V'im lav sham teik furatchem. And if not, it's all over, right? He makes, he makes them an offer that they can't refuse, right? And the Gemara notes this is not exactly fair. And it's not even really productive. It says, Amar Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov Mikan Moda Rabba L'Oraita. So this is a problem in terms of the Torah, right? Because you think about it, later on, right? Like if God comes to someone and says, like, hey, how come you broke my Torah? What can they now say?
Well, you made me.
Right, I never wanted to do it in the first place. You made me do it. So, Amar Rava, Rava comes along and says, Afal Pichen, Hadar Kiblua Bimei Achashverosh. They accepted the Torah again in the time of Achashverosh, which is very strange because the time of Achashverosh, the Jews are not particularly on a very high level. Dichtiv Kimu v'Kiblu HaYehudim. Right, as the pasuk says, the Jews accepted and fulfilled. Kimu masha kiblu kfar. They fulfilled what they already had accepted. Right, so it's a very, very strange Gemara. And there's a tremendous amount of discussion on this. Again, it really is one of my favorite Gemarot. And again, like, what does it mean that God forces you? And what's the, what's the whole idea of that? So literally, I think one of the first Svarim that I ever bought willingly, I'm not talking about like when when I was in school or yeshiva where they told me you had to have books, but one of the first books I ever bought, and as I said, I did go through a Hasidic stage in my life. I think this is like right around the time I'm married, so gosh, it's gone back over 20 years. This is Kedushat Levi. This is Rav Levi Yitzchak Miberditchev. He's one of these like famous Hasidic rabbis where they tell all these stories. He's one of these like, eternal optimist and always defending the Jewish people. All these stories like on Yom Kippur he'd say to God, hey God, if you'll if you'll forgive the Jewish people for all their sins, I'll forgive you for what you've done wrong to us this year. And very interesting, right? I want
to hear God's response to
that. Right. But he asks the very, very famous question, right? It's he quotes this midrash over here and he says, I don't get it. Right? It makes it sound like why the Jews accept the Torah? Because they were forced. But what did the Jews say when they accepted the Torah? Na'aseh v'nishma. That's the exact opposite, right? Na'aseh v'nishma is saying like it's accepting it willingly. So there's a lot of answers to this question of what does it mean that they had to be forced. And again, I don't think that forced. Obviously, I think you know me well enough to. Obviously, I don't think that this literally happened. God lifted up the mountain and there's clods of dirt falling on their head. But so what does it mean that God forced them? So there are a lot of different explanations. I think it means that they were at a certain point where one way or another they could not say no. Whether you want to say it's because they knew they were dependent on God, or do you want to say because they were on such a high level? In other words, like on some level, when you're so close, like what are you supposed to know? Like you're not quite, but you're almost seeing God. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to say no. Whichever way, it just means that there's something about it that it was not willing. There was something, So the Kedushat Levi says an interesting idea, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. He says that when they say Na'aseh v'nishma, that's referring to the Torah Shebichtav. They were willing to accept the Torah Shebichtav. They were excited by that. But when it comes to the Torah Sheba'al Peh, that they had to be forced on, right? And which kind of sounds like a lot of us in school. Like when we're learning Chumash, when we're learning Nach. It's nice. It's stories. God is present. God kills the bad people, and that God's going to be with us. He's going to lead us. Clouds that flatten out mountains and splitting water and food falling from the sky. Oh yeah, I'm cool with that, God. I'm with you. Torah Sheba'al Peh is like it's much less so. It's like this whole sense of, it's definitely much more distant, right? God is no longer clearly in the picture. It's a time of, safek, even to the degree before the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, but even like, the idea, the Chachamim have to figure things out. It's no longer God being so involved, but it's kind of like all of a sudden the people taking over. It's a lot harder work. There's machloket. There's there's a lack of clarity. So there's again this idea. This idea over here again represents. One second. This represents again, this idea that again in the time of Achashverosh, in the time, what is, if that's the case, so what's the Torah that they reaccepted in the time of Achashverosh? The Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now this makes a lot of sense, right? Because what is happening? What does Mordechai represent? In other words, we think about it, which part of Tanakh is he in? Right, he's in the right. He's in Ketuvim, right, or Chetuvim, and it's the time when Nevuah is over. In other words, there was a time when God's presence in the in our lives was very, very obvious. You could feel His presence, and then all of a sudden, by the time of Mordechai already, it starts to switch over to the Torah Sheba'al Peh. There's that lack of. There's no more nevuah. There's no more certainty, right? Like we know, like Shaul HaMelech. He couldn't find his father's animal. So go ask the Navi. It's like I don't know if he helped you. Like win bets on like in your pool or whatever it was. But again, so Purim represents again this time where there's a lack of clarity, where there's a lack of clear sense of God in our lives, and as God fades. Into the picture steps Haman, who's again, at least midrashically, if not more, represents Amalek. This whole idea of Haman's about to come over, and it's about to everything's about, it's going to come across as random, right? And there's actually there's a great midrash. There's a book here somewhere. Books everywhere. A soft cover. Where'd it go?
Right there.
Oh, there we go. Okay, this is a book. I didn't remember that I owned this. Again, I've mentioned it before. Rav Shagar, who unfortunately is no longer alive. Shagar was actually his initials. His name was his last name was Rosenberg. Right? I forgot what the initials are. But Rav Shagar has a sefer on Purim, and he brings down. He brings down a very, very interesting idea, and a lot of what I'm going to talking about tonight is from him. Right. So there's a famous concept. It starts out from the Ari. It's again the Hasidic rabbis really are very into this. That Purim and Yom Kippur are connected. Right. Yom Kippurim and Purim. Right. They sound alike, and then it even goes a step further, and they say Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippur is like Purim. That makes it sound like Purim is is even on the higher level. Yom Kippur copies it. So it's a very strange idea, right? In what sense? You can't think of 2 days that are more opposite. Yom Kippur, there's the Isur Melacha, and you're doing Tshuva, and there's the fear of what's going to be, and you're not eating and drinking, and Purim is like, party, you can do Melacha, and it's, and you're eating, and you're drinking, and you're celebrating, and Simcha. So they seem very, very different. So in what sense are they really connected? So one of the things that we do on Yom Kippur, right? There's the whole avodah that the Kohen Gadol has to do, and one of them is the goral, right? What do we do? What do we draw lots for on Yom Kippur? You remember this, right? There's the shtei hasi'irim, right? There's the two goats. And again, if you read the Mishnayot and the Gemara in Masechet Yoma, you have to find these two goats that look exactly alike. And then the Kohen Gadol would draw a lot. One of them would be La Hashem, and one of them would be La Azazel. Azazel these days we use to mean like hell, but it's like one goat would be given as a korban, and one goat would be taken to the cliff, and don't tell Peter about this. You take him to this rocky cliff, and you throw him off the cliff, and somehow the Jews get forgiveness. And it's a strange idea, but what does the idea of goral represent? When we talk about like a lottery. Right, it's like flipping a coin, right? It's a certain degree. It's like it's chance, right? There's a 50-50 chance. You've got two goats. One's going to be La Hashem, and one's going to be La Azazel. It seems random, which again is like as we're going to see that ties in also this idea we're talking about in terms of Amalek and sort of Hester Panim. It just seems like this random thing, and yet at the same time, the word goral can also mean fate. Right. In other words, which is really the opposite. On the one hand, it's just luck. When you flip a coin, like, wait, who's the guy in Batman?
Harvey Dent.
Right, Harvey Dent. Right, he flips the coin. It's everything is chance. Right, everything is chance. But on the other hand, there's also this. It also connects to fate, which we'll see. And the truth is, the Chachamim actually tie in these two shiurim to famous set of twins who maybe didn't look exactly alike, but Yaakov and Esav. Right, and again, this idea that somehow. What makes it that Yaakov is the chosen one where everything works out well and Esav is not? And this is the whole idea, the same thing with the Seirim, that there's this goral, that there's just luck. Things seem to be random. It just works out this way. And of course, how does that connect to Purim? Right? Purim is, right, the Pur hu hagoral, right? The whole thing is that, that again, Haman, who's again the ultimate guy who represents Amalek, the sense of chance, how does he decide when he's going to kill the Jews? Draw lots, random. Again, that's what Amalek represents, right? And it's interesting. There's actually an idea brought down that that Esther actually brings a little bit of Goral into it as well, right? I mean, I think actually, I don't know if you learned this, but I taught this at Flatbush. I remember we were talking about this, that, the whole plan, like, what is Esther doing? And one of the, like when she makes these parties, like, what's the goal over there? And the whole thing is that she's trying to create this distance between Achashverosh and Haman. They seem to be almost like, birds of a feather. They seem to be like brothers. They have a common interest, right? And she wants to kind of get Achashverosh to not like Haman anymore. So what does she do? She invites them both to a party, right? She, in that famous scene where she goes before Achashverosh and, what would you like? Up to the half of my, and she's, come to a party tomorrow, and, you and Haman. It's like kind of weird. Like the queen's making a party for the king, and some other guy, and that's really, and again, you can imagine like Achashverosh, and that's of course that night is when he can't sleep, and Haman is there, and also, and then again she comes to, again, tomorrow at the party, I'll have another party, and again, it's almost like this goral where now, Achashverosh is, like wondering, like, well, which one of us is she going to choose? Which one, is it, am I the one that she loves, or is it really Haman? Is this maybe Esther is joining up with Haman? There's again this sense of this randomness that Purim represents, just this kind of sense of chance. And that's, that's kind of like the worst thing in the world, when things feel random. In other words, like if you believe that you're suffering, but there's a purpose to it, right? You go to a gym, right? And you work out, and it's hard. Literally, if you look at the whole process when you're working out, it's like literally you're getting these little muscle tears and they're healing, and that's what makes you stronger. It's difficult. it takes a tremendous amount of commitment, and it's very, very hard. But in the end, it's worth it, right? Because in the end, lafum tzara agra, according to the, no pain, no gain. You're suffering, but there's a purpose for it. The worst thing in the world is to have this existence, that Amalek represents of Mikrab, because then it's just like whatever happens to you just feels like it's just cruel. It's purposeless, right? Like the existentialists, Camus, the famous question of just like, why shouldn't you commit suicide? Like, what's it all about, right? It's a kind of depressing thought, but, like, what's it all about? Where just like life feels completely random, and when something bad happens to you, it's not, this loving Father in heaven who has a plan for you, but it's just like, basically like, stinks to be you, and that's what seems to be happening over here, right? There's another midrash. It's actually brought down from Esther Rabbah, and this is really very, very powerful. It says, right, Vayaged lo Mordechai kol asher kara'u. Later on, he finds out what's going on after Haman has convinced Achashverosh to destroy him. And then the Midrash points out, V'lo kativ asher na'aseh. He didn't find out what was done, but rather asher kara'u. Right, we recognize this word from before. Sheba lomar ki kara'lo dvarim shehem mikriyim. Right, what does kara mean? Things happen to him. Random things happen to him. Ki mipnei shelo hishtachabel laHaman asa Haman and kol hadvarim eila. Right? It's these random things. And later on, it actually says like she goes and she the message that Mordechai sends is like kara ben kara. I think is the lashon. Is starting after us. Haman, who represents this chance, the son of chance, is like coming after us. Right? This word is not by chance, that it's used over here. Chazal are saying that it could have said vayas, but it says, kol asher kara. That, again, he recognizes that Haman is this continuation, this idea of Amalek asher kara, that everything is chance, and that everything is supposed to happen, just kind of randomly. And, that's one, and then there's Goral, which is slightly more than that. To some degree, you can say, like, Goral has some sort of a level on it, but neither of these are hashgacha. None of the right hashgacha pratit. I always say, like, if your life is going bad, but you at least feel it's from God, there's some sort of a purpose there, right? You're suffering for a purpose. This loving, your loving father is teaching you something. It's your teacher who's making you work. Whatever mashal you want to use, it's a positive thing. But when life feels like mikrer goral, it feels like very, very depressing, right? And this is what Haman comes to represent, right? And again, we mentioned before Shlomo, who also, he's got everything, and yet he looks at his life and he says, what's this all about, right? And the incredible thing, what does he say in Sefer Kohelet? Mi yodea, right? Who knows? He's the guy who has all this dot. He's the smartest guy in the world, and yet he doesn't know this. Who knows what will happen with you, right? Which, by the way, that's the exact same words that, right? What does Mordechai say to Esther, right? Go before the king. And she says, I can't go before the king. He hasn't called me in a very long time. And if he doesn't, want me to be there, he'll kill me. And right, what does he say? Mi yodea im ka'et lazot, right? This yodea, this word yodea, we're starting to kind of get to this a little bit. This mitzvah of ad lo yada, there's this kind of lack of knowledge. There's the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is like a lack of certainty. And there's, Amalek, which is this, this cruelty, this kind of everything is by chance. And Shlomo Melech says mi yodea, and Mordechai says mi yodea. It's this whole, sense of just like, I don't know. I don't understand what's going on. It seems kind of random, and it's this very, very frustrating thing. And there's another thing that also, comes over and over again, which I think, really represents Amalek as well, right? This is actually at the end of Parshat Beshalach, right? That's actually when they are attacked, and. Right, 1 second. Right after he hits the water, he hits the rock. 1 second. Vayavo Amalek. This is Perek Yudzayin Pasuk Chet. Vayilachem im Yisrael b'Refidim. Vayomer Moshe Yoshua b'char lanu anashim v'tzei lachem ba'Amalek. Now there was some question even the Chachamim had whether this next word was, but it seems tzei b'hilachem ba'Amalek. At least the way we have it, there's a pause there. Machar anochi nitzav al rosh hagiva. Tomorrow I'm going to be standing up there. There's this word machar that comes up over here by Amalek. It also comes up by David and Amalek. And we're going to see 3 places in the Megillah it also comes up, right? This word, which again, seems to not be coincidental, right? That it talks about. 1 second. Perek Hey. Right. Right. The first party. What does Esther say? Right. Yavo HaMelech v'Haman el HaMishteh asher aseh lahem u'machar aseh k'dvar HaMelech. Right? Over here also you have the word machar coming up, which is a word which has been associated with Amalek. Right? A few psukim later, he tells his wife what had happened. Right? V'gam l'machar ani karula im hamelach. He's telling his wife, I'm such an important person, I'm going to be called from machar. And then at the end, right, we have famously, very strange, out of any holiday, right, you have actually 2 different days for the celebration. You have a today and tomorrow. Right? So what's going on over here? Why is this word machar coming? This is, this seems to be, from the Sefer Pachad Yitzchak, Rav Yitzchak Hutner, who's the Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim Berlin, which is right near here. Where is it? On Coney and like L or M. Pachad Yitzchak. Really, it's a fascinating sefer. And he actually quotes the Maharal from this idea of machar, that Amalek represents the Yom. It represents today, right? Like, what's the message of Amalek? Is what you see today is all there is, right? That hiddenness, right? What does the word olam mean? It comes from the word like elim, hidden, right? Like ne'elam, right? It's hidden, it's missing. Amalek represents Yom. That whatever you see, you get, right? Today, whatever, gather ye rosebuds while ye may, right?
Yeah.
The whole thing, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die, right? Great movie. Yeah, don't tell me I haven't seen it. But the whole idea is that Amalek, Dead Poets Society.
I don't watch movies. Right?
Yeah, that's
great.
I meant if you were the kind of person who did. But
in the Newsroom and the West Wing, they also have both of those. That poem.
Right. Yeah, very, very famous poem. But the whole idea is that again, if this world is all there is, if everything is chance, if when you die that's the end. So what should you do in this world? Whatever you want. Enjoy it while you can, because afterwards, what's going to be happening, as Robin Williams says, you're going to be fertilizing the flowers. That's it. That's going to be over. And what does Yisrael represent? It represents this machar. Represents this, maybe next year, right? Lashana haba b'Yerushalayim, right? It's like being a Brooklyn Dodger fan, or, used to be a Red Sox fan. We'll get them next year. It's this sense of, things might not be going so well right now, but Lashana haba b'Yerushalayim, hashta, avdi Lashana haba b'nei chorin. It's this message that even that today, when things look awful and things seem purposeless, and you're just suffering and nothing is good, there's this machar that's going to come. There's this, and if not in this world, then there's olam haba, which again is the exact opposite of Amalek. Amalek represents randomness and chance. Whatever happens to you doesn't make and that's Shlomo's whole fear. Doesn't make a difference if I'm smart or if I'm a fool. Doesn't make a difference if I'm righteous. Davar echad lekulam. It's all that Amalek represents Yom, and Bnei Yisrael represents Machar. It's this sense that even though things seem cruel and purposeless, there really is some sort of a purpose. And the interesting thing also, if you look, the only one who gets that this is not just random is Mordechai, right? I looked up. I'm not going to, just for time's sake, because we're at Victor's house, and I know I don't want him to go upstairs on me in the middle. But it says the word Yada by Mordechai at least 3 times. Everybody else sees what's going on. Again, it's this random happening. Whatever happens, he happens to have this party, and Vashti goes, and Esther happens to be chosen, and then he wants to kill them out, and he happens to open up to that part. Everything seems random, right? And who's the one person who has Yediah, who really understands what's going on? Mordechai. Mordechai is this one guy who realizes that he's this one, island of, understanding of what's going on in a world where everybody thinks it's mikra. So, you have this whole thing that, so many different parts of Purim. The idea of accepting the Torah Sheba'al Peh willingly all of a sudden, that even though you're going into this era, you're going out of the era of Nivuah, where everything is so, certain and known, into this era where, man is going to try to figure out what God wants. You have, the lotteries of Purim and Yom Kippur, and, all this Mikra and Shlomo wonders and everything like that. That's what Amalek does to all of us. It's this sense of we don't even know, who we are. There's this division between what's going on. Do our actions make a difference? Is there any sort of purpose? Is there an olam haba? Why do good things happen to bad people? Why do bad things happen to good people? That's, all those kind of feelings, that's what they represent. So, along comes Purim now, and tells us that maybe it could be different. So there's a famous Gemara in Masechet Gitin, Daf Nun Zayin Amud Bet. This one I think I should be able to find. Yeah. So it says as follows. It goes through a whole list of people who were bad people, and either they themselves became good or had descendants who were good. Tana, we have a Braita. Ne'eman ger toshav haya. Ne'eman, whoever he was a ger toshav. Nevuzdaran ger tzedek haya. Nevuzdaran, who was one of the people who came to destroy Yerushalayim, he became a ger tzedek. And here's the words that apply to us. Mi b'nei banav shel Haman limdu Torah b'bnei Brak. The descendants of Haman learned Torah in Bnei Brak, which again is an interesting question. If Haman was killed and all his sons were killed, how did he have descendants? However you want to figure that out. But, right, somehow, even though, whatever Haman represented, somehow he had these descendants who represented the opposite. They were learning Torah in Bnei Brak. Right? And even though these days, there seem to be a lot of descendants of Haman who are learning Torah in Bnei Brak, there was, in what's it called? Well, what's the yeshiva over there? Panovich. There was recently I've heard about this terrible Chilul Hashem. There's this big split between who should be taking over the yeshiva, and there was literally in the middle of Ma'ariv there was this there was literally like a fight. They had to call the police in. There was blood. I mean, it was like, so when you hear about that, you could really imagine like, oh, those are the descendants of Haman who were learning Torah in Bnei Brak. But it's obviously making a more serious point than that. So, it's interesting. What do you mean? Like, who is this? Who are these descendants? So it's interesting. I don't know if anybody remembers from the Pesach Seder. We're basically a year out. Already last year was was a leap year, so we're more or less 12 months out. Who is it who is from Bnei Brak? Which of the Chachamim was from Bnei Brak? Come on. What do they teach you in Flavish?
Nothing,
right? Okay. Rabbi Akiva is from Bnei Brak. And it's an interesting thing. There are those who say, actually, this is from Rabbi Ari Khan, who he's a big Talmid Chacham. He lives in Israel. He teaches at I think at Bar Ilan. He teaches a little bit of Eshet Torah. So some of this is actually what inspired me to think about this. Point out that there are some who say that Rabbi Akiva was the descendant of Haman. Which is, it's pretty powerful. I mean, we're going to see who Rabbi Akiva is, right? And in fact, if you look even in the Gemara, the very famous Gemara where Rabban Gamliel gets, the whole thing of Rabban Gamliel gets into one of his fights with Rabbi Yoshua. They're, arguing, and he embarrasses Rabbi Yoshua, and they say, okay, you're out as the Nasi. And they're trying to figure out who should they choose. Right, and one of the people they consider, because he is the most brilliant, or one of the most brilliant, is Rabbi Akiva. And it says, why not? Dilma anishle delete zchut avot. He does not have he does not have good ancestors in his past, right? And this leads to at least the possibility that why is it, he was a convert or he was a descendant of converts, and some, so there are those who actually believe that he represents, that he's the descendant of Haman. Which I'm going to develop, but again, he seems, as we're going to see, he's really the flip side of Haman. It's the idea of Haman is mikra. We're going to see, and kind of seeing everything as random. Rabbi Akiva is very much not that, right? And we know, like, all the stories about Rabbi Akiva's life is tremendously tragic. Besides the fact, like, the first 40 years of his life, he's not a Talmid Chacham, he's a total Amaretz. He says he hated the Chachamim, right? And first of all, his life does seem to have some mikra, right? How does he realize that he could learn Torah even though he's 40 years old? Right? He sees the water dripping on a rock. Right? What's more random than that? It's not like... I
thought the rock told him that he could do anything. I could be an actor and you could be a rabbi.
Right. No, it's, that's the thing. It's like this, it's so random, water dripping on a rock. It's not like, if someone says, okay, God, if the next person says to me that, this is like, he sees water dripping on a rock. Water drips on rocks. And yet somehow he takes that, instead of looking at it and just saying, that's random. He takes it as a message. Rabbi Akiva is the one who, again, he's the antidote to Amalek. He's the one who kind of sees, even in things that appear to be chance, he recognizes, messages from God even when they're not as clear, right? And he's also the one we know, he has this awful death, right? There's a very, very powerful Gemara. He's such a fascinating figure that, Moshe Rabbeinu, says to Hashem, why are there the tagin on the letters of the Torah, right? There are these little like crowns on top of some letters, and God says there's going to be someone who's going to learn out tilei halachot from it, piles and piles of halachot. And Moshe says, cool, can I see him? And God sends him forward, and he's in Rabbi Akiva's shiur. And Rabbi Akiva represents. We're going to, we'll build this up a little bit more. But Rabbi Akiva is he's this tremendous Talmid Chacham. All of Torah Sheba'al Peh comes from him, really. And yet, at the end of his life, what happens to him? He's brutally murdered by the Romans, right? And it says, right? And it says the Chachamim, right? And Moshe Rabbeinu sees this, right? And that's what he says. He says to God after he sees Rabbi Akiva is so great. He says, "What's his reward? What happens to him?" And he shows him. And Moshe says, "Zu Torah v'zu schara." This is Torah and this is a reward? How can, that makes it seem like, right? If you see that happening, right? When people see bad things happening to good people, what do they say?
Why be good?
Right, why be good? The world is random. It doesn't make it. That's Shlomo HaMelech. What difference does it make if you're a Rabbi Akiva or if you're a bad guy? You're just going to die anyway. And yet Rabbi Akiva, still, he represents this tremendous hope. Right? He's the one who had 24,000 students. The Gemara tells us, Masechah Yevamot, actually it says 12,000 pairs. And what happens to them? They all die. And you would think like, oh my God, like your entire life's work, you work for 24 years and your wife suffers and and then it's all over. I mean, you would just what do you do at that point? You just put your head down and cry, like everything you build. And it says, no, what does he do? He gathers 5 students, and he who end up being the whole basis for the Torah Shebichtav. Right? Again, the same Torah Shebichtav, which we said the Jews accepted by Purim. He's, again, this, even when life seems to beat him down and give him the message that life is just cruel and purposeless, he still is the one who has the ability to see something positive and to not give up hope. He's the one who, again, he represents Machar. He's the one who says, okay, you know what? Yeah, my students are all dead. Yeah, all my work is gone. But if I start working now, if I build these 5 up, there's going to be a tomorrow. That's the antidote to Amalek. Right, and finally, right, very, very famous Gemara at the end of Makot, right, the Chachamim are walking on Har HaBayit, and it's all been destroyed, and what do they see running out of the place from the Kodesh Kodeshim? They see a shual, right, a fox running out, and all the rabbis start to cry, and Rabbi Akiva laughs. He said, why are you laughing? He said, why are you crying? And they say, this is the place where, anyone other than a Kohen Gadol who went into it is going to die, and now there's like a fox running through it. How can we not cry? And he says, he says, that's why I'm laughing. Right? He says, because there was the Nevuah, there were 2 different prophecies. One is that the Beit HaMikdash would be destroyed and it would all be plowed over. And 2 is that there would, that in the future things would turn around. And until things were destroyed, I thought, who knows what's going to be in the future? But now that I see that the first Nevuah is fulfilled, I see that the future part's going to, things are going to turn out well. He's the Machar, right? They're looking at it, the Yom, it seems so cruel, life is so, horrible, the descendants of Amalek, Rome, have just destroyed everything. And what do they say to Rabbi Akiva? You've comforted us. Rabbi Akiva is the one who has the ability to see that machar. He's the one who has that ability, to see even what even Shlomo HaMelech, Chachami Kol Adam, couldn't see. That the fact that even when things seem cruel and randomless, that even when it seems like God is absent from the picture, like it seems in Megillat Esther, that it's all there, right? And then just to kind of wrap this up, right? There's a bracha that, right? It says in the Masechet Brachot, right, that when you see something good or something good happens, what bracha do you say? You say, Baruch Atah Hashem Hatov V'Hametiv. Right? And when something bad happens, what do you say? Baruch Atah Hashem Dayan Ha'emet. Right? And it says, a person, you have to say a bracha by both, but, when something bad happens, you can't really say, God, Hatov V'Hametiv, I know that that's really for the good. It says in the future, again, Machar, in the future, it says here, Dayan Ha'emet's going to go away. Why? What are we going to realize? That even the bad things that happen, right? When we see bad things happening to good people and we think it's random, what are we going to realize in the future? Hatov V'Hametiv. All of it was really for good. And who is Rabbi Akiva? What's his famous, right? What's the famous story with Rabbi Akiva? He learned from his Rebbe, Nachum Ish Gamzo, right? That, famous story. He's outside of the city and, he tries to go to the city and, nobody lets him stay there, so he has to stay in the field, and he's got fire with him and it gets blown out, and he has animals with him, and they die, and keeps on saying, Kol Ma David Rahman L'Tavav. Everything that God does is for the best. Right? And of course, how does it turn out? The next morning, he goes to that city, and it's like one of these scenes like in Gladiator, there's smoke coming from the ground. The entire city has been destroyed. And he realizes, if he had stayed in the city, he would have been killed. And if he had been in the field and he would have had his fire, they would have seen him. And if his animals would have made noise, they would have seen him. Right? Again, Rabbi Akiva, who's the descendant of Haman, he's the one who, he's the antithesis to Haman. He's the one who sees that in everything that happens where it seems that the world is random, that really it's the Yad Hashem that is going on over there. Right? And that B'chol Drachecha Da'ehu, know God, through everything. And of course, he's the one who, when he dies at the end, he's saying Shema. Right? And we know, right, his students say to him, how can you be saying Shema even now? And he says, B'chol Nafshecha, even if God takes your life. But what else does Shema say? B'chol me'odecha, right? B'chol midah u'midah she'Hashem oded lecha. Whatever God gives you, you're supposed to love God. And it also says b'chol levavcha, your yetzer hara, yetzer hatov. Rabbi Akiva is the one who has the ability that even, whether things look good, whether things look bad, yetzer hara, yetzer hatov, Baruch Mordechai or Arur Haman, where we see split, where we have, the split which was created all the way by the eating of the Eitz Hadat. Rabbi Akiva is the one who's able to pull this together. And this, brings us back to, so what's the Ad Lo Yada? Shlomo HaMelech had yediah. He had knowledge. He was the wisest from all men. But sometimes, again, our knowledge only gives you what you see, right? It's like, it's like with science. Science can only test what's here right now. Why does the world exist? Science can't tell you. It can tell you what, it can tell you about gravity, which, the latest theory in, some parts of physics is that gravity is not really true. There's all these, science can test things that are in front of you, but it can't test things that are not. Yediah only gets you so far. The message of Purim is that sometimes when you look at the world through Yediah, if you just look at the world rationally, the world seems like a world of Haman, it seems like a world of Amalek, of Hester Panim, of just, it's random. It's just, you see so many, I forgot her name, this terrible tragedy, this girl who was, a couple of years ago, her parents were driving the car and she was, they threw rocks and, she was badly injured and she survived. Now this week she ended up dying of an illness. You see that and your heart breaks. You just look at it and you just say, you echo Moshe Rabbeinu, Zu Torah v'Zu Schara, God, come on, where are you in this world? And the whole idea is that if we just look at the world just purely through rational eyes, just through knowledge, we don't see it. Purim represents this idea that sometimes you have to, ad delo yada, you need to go above that. You need to sometimes you need to turn off your brain and tune in your heart. The bechol levavcha, you have to be, sometimes you have to get past your head to be able to recognize what's really in your heart, to be able to, really see that, discover what's inside of you. And that's the famous words, nichnas yayin yotzei sod. When we drink, right? Yayin and soda actually have the same gematria, which I think is actually kind of interesting. Nichnas yayin yotzei sod. When you drink, and again, it doesn't mean getting smashed and laying on the street. But again, if done the right way, the whole idea of Purim is to let go for one day of the year of the fact that you have to understand everything and everything has to make sense, and to just let the truth that's above knowledge come out. That's what Purim represents. Ad delo yada, the ability to just one day a year shut off, the part of your brain that makes you think that the world is just random and cruel and just science and no God, and to just recognize that there's a level beyond that of just where if you see with the right eyes, if you see with the eyes of Rabbi Akiva, then even the worst thing, even when your whole life is over, even when everything you've built looks like it's over, there still is this machar. That's what Purim represents.